Living in Virginia, you're in the fast lane on the information superhighway. We've invested $3 billion in Virginia's broadband network to give you one of the fastest internet connection speeds in the world, so you can build relationships, bring new business to our state, and meet the future of education. It's amazing what we can do together. Visit VCTA.com to learn how broadband connects the Commonwealth.
From the General Assembly and the City of Richmond, I'm Woody Evans for Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and Comcast, connecting Virginians to their government. We're pleased to have the Democratic leader of the House of Delegates with us today, David Toscano. Good to see you, sir.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Great. We're a few days away from hopefully ending this session. How do you feel about the budget at this point?
Well, you know, the budget's still up in the air. Recall where we've been, you know, the House passed a budget that is about $600 million more than the Senate's budget. And the reason for that is that the House decided to accept federal money to expand Medicaid and brought about $400 million into our budget that we can then expend for things that people think are important, like teacher raises, public employee raises, more funding for higher education, more funding for K through 12. The Senate did not accept the Medicaid money, so that's where the chasm is right now. And the way it works, of course, is the House passes a budget, the Senate passes a budget, and if they're not the same, it goes into a conference committee, and those conferees from the Senate and the House try to work out the details of a compromised budget. That's where we are right now. Hopefully, we'll get a compromised budget so we can fund the government and get out of here within our 60-day period that we usually have for these long sessions.
Now, as I understand it, the Democrats made a significant concession in terms of funding of Medicaid. Talk to us about that.
Sure. There are two pieces to the Medicaid funding. One is the actual dollars that will be brought back to help some 400,000 Virginians who can take advantage of Medicaid expansion. But the second piece is an interesting piece, and that's a piece that will allow Medicaid recipients to get training for jobs if they're capable of working. They call it a work requirement. It is not technically a work requirement because you don't have to work, but you would have opportunities to get training. You'd have opportunities to do some community service if you're able to do so. Most people don't realize that most people on Medicaid are disabled people, children, or folks who are elderly and cannot work. But some possibly could, and so the compromise was put in some kinds of requirements that will allow people to take advantage of training in exchange for getting the federal dollars.
Now, that work requirement is still subject to approval by the federal government, is it not?
That's right. The way it works is you have to apply for what's called a waiver to the federal government to say, we want to do our Medicaid program a little bit differently than just strictly expanding Medicaid. And so the bill that was passed requires the state government to apply to Washington for that waiver. Then Washington has to approve the waiver so that we can put in these training requirements, et cetera. At the same time, we will already expand Medicaid in the traditional way. So you have these two tracks going down parallel to each other, where you have expansion of Medicaid and you also have an application for a waiver to do the work requirement, the training piece. If the federal government does not approve the training piece, Medicaid expansion still continues. It just continues in the most traditional way without the training or the work requirement.
Now, without the training or the work requirement and the traditional way, however, is the funding the same or different?
The funding will be the same so that we can get access to the monies right away, and those monies can be factored into our budget. And that's really important because if we can access federal dollars for Medicaid, it can replace money that we are putting that are into things like indigent care, which is over $100 million a year that we're funding from our state taxpayers right now. That money would be replaced by the federal dollars, and that $100 million is now in indigent care can go to help pay for teacher raises, for example, or public safety officers. And that's how it works, how the federal dollars replace the state dollars, so we can spend the state dollars on things that Virginians consider to be important.
So why is there so much opposition on the Senate side?
Well, I think, some people are very concerned about the long-term impacts of Medicaid expansion, because remember, as our society ages, there's more and more demand for Medicaid services, with the result is that the budget has tended to increase over time. So some people are concerned that if you put more people into Medicaid, the budget will continue to increase for Medicaid expansion. The other thing they're worried about is that the federal government might renege on their promise. Right now, federal government in traditional Medicaid expansion, traditional Medicaid spending, puts up $1 for every dollar we put in. Mm-hmm. But for Medicaid expansion, it's a much better deal because the feds will put up 90 cents to 100 cents for every 1 cent we put in. So that's for every 10 cents we put in. So that's a much better deal for us. We get more federal dollars that can take us a longer way.
You mentioned our aging population. I understand that there are dual eligibles who are recipients of Medicaid, primarily those people who can't afford institutionalization if they get very ill during their elderly years.
Right. Yeah, and this is where it is really complicated. A lot of people don't understand that there are two programs out there. There's Medicare, which is insurance for people over age 65, and it's not eligibility based. I mean, you hit 65, you're eligible for Medicare, but there's also Medicaid, which is a combination of state and federal dollars, which serves people who are by and large unable to work independent of their age. Now, when you say dual eligible, that's where you get that population that's over 65 who are disabled and poor, with those people who can get on Medicare. We can coordinate how those services and the monies to support them are accessed through this dual eligibility program, and therefore save money for Medicaid, and which is what we are trying to do. And it is complex, but it's important for people to understand the difference between Medicare and Medicaid, something that I didn't understand for a long, long time. But we can save money if we do it the right way, and our state offices are doing a lot to coordinate that eligibility to minimize the consequence on the Virginia taxpayer.
Now, the expansion of Medicaid will also help in the sense that, at least theoretically, people will have access to doctors versus an emergency room.
That's really important, Woody, because if you get sick, it doesn't matter whether you broke your ankle or you just have a cold, and you show up at the emergency room, the costs are much more expensive than if you take your cold to your primary physician. And if you are not insured, the tendency is for you to go to the emergency room. If you're if you have Medicaid or you have private insurance, you can go to your physician at a cost that might be 1/10 of what the emergency room cost is. That lessens the cost for everybody for their health care, potentially has a dampening effect on premiums, and also has an impact on our budget, because we would rather have people be seen in their physician's office than to go to the emergency room and incur a lot more expenses that eventually have to get paid from somebody, whether through Medicaid or private insurance, or if there's no insurance, through the state budget. So we think that Medicaid expansion will encourage more use of primary care physicians rather than ERs, and therefore save money.
And there's a debate going on not only within the Commonwealth but nationwide as to whether health care should be a right guaranteed to all citizens. I think a lot of people don't understand, or at least some people argue that it's already a right to the extent that a hospital cannot refuse service to an individual who cannot afford health care.
Absolutely. I mean, healthcare is not a right under the Constitution, but boy, it is a necessity. And it is a right if you walk into the ER and you're severely injured or damaged, and they've got to treat you. And if you can't afford to pay, you and I who have private insurance, we directly pay, or our state government pays when UVA sends a bill for indigent care because somebody can't afford to pay, or if somebody declares bankruptcy because their health expenses are too high, we pay for that too. So there is no free lunch, shall we say. People pay. And the other way that people pay, if you don't have good insurance and you don't get treated early enough for illnesses, your illnesses may become worse, with the result that you may lose time from work, your employer suffers, you suffer, the economy suffers. So even though we don't often think of it as a constitutional right, to have a good healthcare system where people get served and get treated and their illnesses get addressed helps the economy, helps productivity, and helps the society.
And I take it that this problem in terms of the people who we want to expand health care through Medicaid is highlighted at least once a year here in the Commonwealth in Wise, Virginia, the remote clinic. Talk to us about that.
Right. Well, every year in Southwest Virginia, they have this thing called the RAM, Remote Access Medical Care, where doctors from all over the Commonwealth go to Southwest Virginia, and for several days they set up this huge operation where people who don't have medical insurance can come and be treated for free. Thousands of people line up to be treated, and it shows you the need that's out there, especially in impoverished communities, to get access to decent health care. And if we think that if Medicaid was expanded, a number of those people who have to wait till once a year to do things with their teeth or their eyes or other illnesses they may have, they could go and take advantage of seeing a physician, get treated earlier, become more productive citizens, and feel better about themselves and their lives. But they don't have access to health care right now, except through this one time a year event in Southwest Virginia.
And all of this has been exacerbated over the last few years as a result of the opioid crisis.
Right, and there are we've had a terrible problem all over this country with opioid addiction, where people sometimes don't understand exactly how to use their medicine appropriately, and they get addicted to these medications. And once you're addicted, it's very difficult to get off of it. And because a lot of, we don't have people seeing physicians on a regular basis, they can self-medicate, which gets them addicted, and then they lose more time from work, and there are all kinds of other problems that are associated with it, including the possibility of death. We have, thousands of people who die every year because of this addiction. We're trying to get our arms around it in Virginia as well as other places in the country by passing new laws that may make it more difficult for prescriptions to be issued for these heavy-duty medications that can kill you if you don't use them appropriately. But the key is for people to have regular health care experiences with their physicians, and the physicians are monitoring them to make sure that they're using the medications in a proper fashion.
Now, I think you've been a member of the General Assembly since you left local government for about 12 years now, and I know last week you gave an impassioned speech on the floor of the House indicating that you had never stepped up to talk about guns in any detail at least, but you were prompted to do that as a result of remarks of one of your other colleagues.
Right. Well, when I arrived in 2006, Tim Kaine had just been elected governor. Both bodies were controlled by Republicans. The Democrats in the House really didn't have, I think we had 40 members out of 100. So the prospects of passing any gun legislation were pretty slim at that time. And you know, I'm from an area which is primarily urban, but it's rural all around me. So guns are an issue, both in the urban center where there's a strong sentiment for gun safety, and in the rural areas around where there's a lot of hunting and people are, you know, they're close to their guns. So, you know, I hadn't really offered much gun legislation. There were a few gun safety bills that I'd put in. And I don't think I'd ever gotten on the House floor to give a morning hour speech on guns. But, you know, I've written a lot about it, but this shooting in Parkland really affected a lot of people. And I think people, they no longer believe that thoughts and prayers are enough to solve this problem. We've got to do some things that will help solve this problem. And so I talked about a couple of things. One is, take the Las Vegas shooting. The Las Vegas shooting could not have occurred to the extent it did without bump stocks, without a bump stock. A guy just wouldn't kill as many people. So why do we need bump stocks for hunting? We don't really. All it does is increase how fast you can fire a firearm. So I said, let's ban bump stocks. Even Donald Trump supported that, or at least he has, depending on the day.
Sure.
Then take the Florida shooting. The Florida shooting was perpetrated by a young man who bought an assault weapon when he was under the age of 21. You know, I'm not sure that that's the most appropriate thing to do. I think we have some regulations that don't allow you to buy certain pistols without being age 21. Why not a prohibition that would prevent people from buying an assault weapon unless you're over 21? So that's another bill, pretty easy. And then finally, there are some bills that are being passed out in other states right now which would allow a family member to petition a judge to say, look, my son or my husband looks like he's having some mental issues. We need to have a temporary restraining order to take his gun away until his mental illness issues have been resolved. A temporary order that could have addressed some of these other shootings that have occurred. So those are three common sense things you could do. You throw on some expanded background checks and you've got a good gun safety proposal. So I got up, made that proposal. Hasn't gone anywhere yet, but we'll see.
So what's the opposition to that type of common sense gun legislation?
Well, you know, if you were sitting, if you're standing in the shoes of the other side, I think they would say that this is a slippery slope. If you start regulating these kind of guns in this kind of way, you're eventually going to go down the road towards gun confiscation. And that gets people really worried. And I understand that worry. But you know, you don't have to go down the whole slope. You can take a piece and say, okay, we're going to do this, this, and this. When we had the huge, we've had in the past, huge issues with auto safety, right? Mm-hmm. 50,000 people at one time a year were getting killed in auto accidents. We didn't want to take away their cars. What we did was we passed auto safety legislation that required seatbelts, airbags. We did things with roads. We did things to improve the safety of vehicles. We didn't take away the cars. When smoking was a big issue, we did things. We didn't take away their cigarettes. We taxed them, okay? We made them such that kids under 21 couldn't buy them. We put certain prohibitions on them designed to minimize the impact. So just because we take an action doesn't mean we're going to take away people's guns. And in fact, I would be opposed to that, and I think so many people would be. So let's not worry too much about the slippery slope. Let's do what we can to address a very specific problem related to these mass shootings. Firearms, guns is a bigger issue. Suicide's a huge issue, which is only going to be addressed through mental health funding. So there's a lot to be done.
And of course, you would think that gun owners would have been now satisfied with the Supreme Court decision that now recognizes an individual right to bear an arm in self-defense.
That's right. That's the Heller decision decided several years ago, pretty much established that. And I think, you know, if you look, if you did a poll of gun owners around the country, even NRA members, they support universal background checks and enhanced universal background checks so you can really test out whether somebody has a mental disability that might make it difficult or problematic for them to have a gun. But yet, when these bills come to be voted on, either in Washington or in Richmond, the gun lobby then comes out of the woodwork and says, wait, I don't want that done, and it doesn't get done.
Talk to us about your resolution in support of, or in memory of, Heather Heyer.
Sure. Well, this is a resolution I proposed and was adopted just the other day to memorialize the life of Heather Heyer, the young woman who was killed in Charlottesville when, I guess you could say a domestic terrorist basically weaponized his vehicle, drove it down a small street, injured a lot of people, and killed Heather. And the resolution talked about the importance of recognizing the need to stand up against racial oppression, white supremacy, neo-Nazism. And Heather was a young lady, and she sacrificed her life for love and justice. And I think it's important that the General Assembly memorialize that, and my colleagues agreed, and I didn't get one dissenting vote. And we'll deliver the memorial resolution to her mom in Charlottesville, and she lives on with us, even though she's gone, and her memory I don't think will ever go away.
So what's happening in Charlottesville now in terms of the Confederate statute issue?
Well, it's still in court. This is a very complicated legal question. A lot of people think it's very easy to say, yeah, either we want the statues or we don't. Well, it's more complicated because the statues were given to the city by a philanthropist. They weren't erected by some group of white supremacists. They happened to be erected during the time of Jim Crow and a lot of pro-Confederacy initiatives. But the philanthropist didn't, when he gave the statues, and they were both Lee and Jackson, didn't have that as part of his gift to the city. So those statues, and whether they come down, are still in litigation. There were tarps on the statues that the city council put on, but the judges now ruled you had to take them off. So the tarps are down. I don't think this issue's going away anytime soon. I put in a bill this time that would have permitted localities, or clarified that localities had the ability to regulate statues in public places. That bill was defeated. And so there's some questions about whether the locality can even do anything with the statues now, independent of the fact that I think a lot of people in the city after August 12th believe the statue shouldn't be there. There's a lot of different views about statues, but I think everybody's agreed that white supremacy doesn't have a place in this country of ours. And we got a long ways to go before we really address that problem and heal the wounds that were opened up on August 12th.
I know Virginia is a Dillon rule state, and you can talk about that in some detail if you like, but whatever happened to the concept of local control?
Yeah, good question. Whatever happened to that? I thought that was a very conservative idea, that the government that's closest to the people ought to be the government that's preeminent. And that philosophy only works so far. In Virginia, of course, we are a Dillon rule state, which means that anything that is not specifically allocated for the local governments to do is the province of the state. So we often have to put in these bills that, quote, enable local government to do things that are not permitted. That's what my bill would have done, would have enabled every locality to make a decision about their public monuments in public places. That bill was defeated. So there's also a statute now that says that you can't take down Confederate monuments or any kind of other war memorial that's been erected. That's a state statute, and that's where you run up with the problem of whether you can take these down in Charlottesville, and that's what the judge is going to decide.
Rate freeze legislation. There was utility legislation this session. It has now passed, I believe. You were successful in attaching an amendment on the House side. I think that was adopted on the Senate side as well. Yet you voted against the bill on the floor of the House.
Right.
Explain to us why that occurred and why you voted against the bill.
You love bringing up these complicated issues. All these complicated issues, Medicaid, Medicare, and this bill. Well, first of all, I think many people know that several years ago we put in a rate freeze to give customers some confidence that their rates were not going to go up in the aftermath of what was happening in DC with the adoption of the Clean Energy Plan. People were worried about the rates going up, so we froze the rates. Well, now with Trump coming in, that Clean Energy Plan doesn't exist anymore, and so people thought, well, we shouldn't have this rate freeze in effect anymore, because what it does is allow the utilities to keep what were called over-earnings. And they had been over-earning for several years to the tune of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars. So we came and tried to develop a bill that would speak to that. That bill got very big and very complex and had a lot of things in it. One of the things it had in it was the permission, gave permission for the utilities to what they call double count or double dip, that they would be able to take their profits and invest those profits, but then get a return on the investment of those profits. Some of us didn't think that was a good idea, so I offered an amendment on the floor that stripped that out of the bill. That was a big deal, and it was one of the first times I think we've seen an amendment on the House floor directed at the utilities actually passed. That was passed by the Senate, so the bill came back to the House. I voted ultimately against the bill because I think as you're looking at transforming this grid, which all the distribution lines, how they get to the homes, your metering, how did that work with how you're generating electricity. I thought there should be more state oversight through the State Corporation Commission. This bill kind of took some of that authority away. I want it fully restored because I think the public has an interest in trying to determine what the grid looks like in the next 20 years. That's why I voted against the bill, even though there's a lot of good things in the bill, particularly in terms of money for weatherization for low-income families, a lot of good stuff with solar and wind energy. There's a lot of good things in the bill, but I wanted more public control over how the grid is transformed over time.
About 30 seconds left. Yogi Berra used to say it's hard to predict the future, but do you think you'll be out of here by this Saturday with a budget?
Well, it's interesting. The first year I came down here in 2006, we didn't get a budget until June 28th.
Wow.
So there is the possibility that we will not finish on March 10th, that we'll have to go into a little bit of an overtime. I'll tell you, the governor is going to be pretty active if that happens. He could send down a bill with his own budget and basically say to the House and the Senate, okay, here's my bill, vote it up or down. We need a budget, we need it soon. Localities are trying to plan for their budgeting. We need a budget, we're going to get it soon. So I don't think we're going to stay much longer than March 10th, but I hope that we'll get a budget by Saturday.
Great, thank you for being here, David Toscano.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and Comcast. Until next time, I am Woody Evans. Mm-hmm.